Good evening, everyone. I think we'll make a start. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Thank you. So welcome to the Catalyst. I'm Jane Robinson. I'm Pro Vice-Chancellor for Engagement and Place at Newcastle University. And really delighted to see so many people here this evening for tonight's Newcastle Debate event. And this is the fifth in the series of these events that we've been running around topical debates. Firstly, just one or two housekeeping items. If I could ask you to put your phones on silent, that would be much appreciated. And we're not expecting a fire alarm, so if it does sound, please follow the instructions of our event stewards and make your way out of the building to the square outside. If you are tweeting about the event, and we would encourage you to do so, please share your thoughts using the hashtag Newcastle Debates. We will also, just to let people know, be recording tonight's events as it was a popular event, so we'll be sharing that afterwards. I should say that unfortunately Hugh Lewis from Nexus, who was due to join the panel, is unwell today, so we just have three panellists tonight, but I'm very confident that they will be able to address the questions that you put to them, given their vast range of experience. So tonight we will be discussing the future of transport in the North East. And I think it is very timely for a number of reasons, not least because the government recently announced the North East is to receive 563 million in funding for transport infrastructure, which is part of the 1.4 billion devolution deal for the region. I think there are questions around what that will mean for some long-standing issues for the region and whether it will deliver those improvements around public transport infrastructure. And I think questions around whether a directly elected mayor for the North East could help encourage investment in more sustainable travel. And no doubt our panel will have something to say on those questions amongst many others. And we have already received a number of interesting questions which were submitted in advance by the audience, and I will put those to the panel shortly. But if you would like to join in, we'll have time for questions from the audience as well. I'm going to briefly introduce our panellists. As I say, we're very grateful to our panel this evening. We have to my left Professor Phil Blythe, CBE, who is Professor of Intelligent Transport Systems, which we will hear more about, no doubt, Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and former Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Transport. Next to Phil, we have Councillor Jane Byrne, who is the Cabinet Member for a Connected, Clean City at Newcastle City Council. And Jane leads the Council's approach to environment and transport priorities, including low carbon plans and improving connectivity for living, working and visiting the city. And to the far end, last but no means least, really delighted to be joined by Tobin Hughes, who is the Managing Director for Transport North East and is the Director General of Nexus as well, responsible for delivering transport policy and strategy, programmes and initiatives on behalf of the North East Joint Transport Committee. Also very particularly pleased to have Tobin as a Newcastle University graduate with over 20 years experience working in aviation, bus and rail transport. So ladies and gentlemen, your panel for this evening. So before we dive into the questions, I was just going to ask each of the panelists just to very briefly say take their sort of headline perspective on this question of the future for transport in the North East. So perhaps if I could start with you, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I run the Future Mobility Group at Newcastle University, and what we're always doing is looking at how we can harness the real state-of-the-art and the horizon scanning opportunities for making transport better. What does that mean in the short term? Where do we need investment to deliver that in the long term? And as Jane mentioned, I was Chief Scientific Advisor down at the Department for Transport for 6 years until June 21. And there, anything to do with science, technology, engineering, that could better transport, whether that's electrification, whether that's making transport more accessible, automation and everything else. That was my remit, and I want to bring those opportunities to the North East and make sure where appropriate, because it's not always the solution, but where appropriate, we make sure that the North East is the exemplar of how we can turn our great region into the best and well-connected transport region in the UK. Long way to go, but we're getting there.
Thank you very much. And Jane, as an elected member, your perspective?
Well, the first thing for me is, of course, I'm not a transport expert. I'm a local councillor who has the responsibility through my cabinet portfolio for environment and transport, which means I'm the person responsible for bins and roads. So I get a lot of emails, as you can imagine.
All the best, yes.
Yes. I mean, but my main role with regards to transport is to work with the transport team on delivering our transport policy, which is about making sure that people can move around. That includes ensuring that people who don't have access to a car can move around the city and access opportunities. We're particularly interested in developing active travel because of the public health benefits, but also because it links to our environmental commitments to be net zero by 2030. And we're doing that all in the context of, you won't be surprised to hear me say that, huge cuts in local government funding, which have left us with real challenges, and a reliance on, thus far, on having to apply to specific pots and specific projects for funding. So rather than being able to have a coherent plan of our own that we can develop and fund, we have to bid for what's available, which is why the potential opportunities offered by a devolution deal are so attractive.
Thank you, Jane. And Tobin, from your point of view?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about the future of transport in the North East. I would say that. There are challenges in the here and now, and I dare say we may be picking some of those up as we go this evening. But the future is really quite exciting. The devolution deal has been mentioned a couple of times already, and it will be some more. That gives us a chance to get much stronger governance of transport, much better voice for the North East projected into the government, a better face that we can present to external investors, and besides we'll have a bit of money ourselves to make some wise investments. So there are some really good opportunities over the next 5 years to pursue. So look forward to talking about some of those as we go.
Thank you very much to you all. And I mean, you've all I think talked about challenges and opportunities. And one of the a number of questions that came in from our audience members are around the current state of affairs, and in particular the public transport. And one of the questions we've had is whether public transport in our region is reliable enough for people to make the switch from their cars. And what is the answer for someone for whom using a car is a necessity? I just wonder, maybe, Jane, if I could start with you. You made the point about active travel and the link between transport and sustainability, which is so important. What would your response be to that question?
Is public transport reliable enough? No. I don't think there's any more to be said on that one. I think we all understand the problems. In terms of people making the switch from cars, I mean, I'm a driver myself. I have to drive to work because of where my job is in County Durham. So I understand why it's a necessity, but what I would say to everybody is it may be a necessity for some journeys. What you should try and look to do, which is what I do as well, is to think about which journeys you could change. And that's why so much of our focus on Newcastle is trying to rethink people making short car journeys. So that might be introducing school streets so that people have the option of walking with their children to school, or feeling that their children will be safe walking and cycling themselves to school. So it's not about completely changing the way you live, it's about thinking about what small changes you can make. And if we all make small changes, that is the big change.
Okay, thanks, Jen. And Tobin, I imagine a lot of your day job is sort of dealing with sort of challenges around the reliability of public transport. What would your reflections be on that question?
Well, I'm going to start by agreeing wholeheartedly with what Jane has said, because we need to get people travelling in the most sustainable way possible, partly because of public health. We know that 70% of adults in this region are overweight or obese. We know how many people suffer from the causes of physical inactivity impacting their health. And we know that a lot of people just can't get around for a whole variety of reasons. We need to encourage people to travel sustainably. And Jane's point about It's not about banning cars. It's not about providing the best public transport service in the world, nice though that would be. It's about making enough difference to have a public transport and walking and cycling network that is attractive enough for people to not take those journeys that they didn't need to. Because one of the figure that keeps on sticking with me is 64% of trips in the northeast are taken by car. That's all the trips that are taken. I'm still shocked when I say it because it's just a ridiculously high number. If you take into account that includes kids going to school, it includes people going down the local shop, it's obviously people travelling to work. And so every single trip, 64% of them by car, either as a driver or a passenger, and that's just too many. And if we could move a relatively small number of those trips onto sustainable transport, all of our buses and trains would be full all of the time, and we would be able to get 3% of those, treble the number of people walking and cycling. So that should be our goal. How do we get there? And to the question of am I managing ongoing issues with reliability? Well, of course, that is the case. Our rail network is performing particularly poorly at the moment. The local rail services are suffering from a shortage of drivers and a whole heap of infrastructure issues. The metro system, jewel in the crown though it absolutely is of our area, and it's outperforming many, many other transit systems, it's still struggling itself, largely because of its age, with one or two other challenges that have happened over the winter. And this region just doesn't, in recent history, have enough history of people going out and trying walking and cycling. So there's a lot that we need to do to make it more reliable to use the bus, the metro and the train, and to make it more attractive to walk and cycle.
Thank you. I think many people might sort of say that's it, linking those two things, you know, getting out of your car is absolutely dependent on our having that confidence and the reliability of public transport. And I think we'll come back to whether the extent to which the devolution deal could help us to start to address some of those concerns. But Val, I want to bring you in very much in terms of thinking about, you know, what does good look like in terms of the future and some of the things that when you were advising the Department for Transport, how do you address that challenge around getting that switch from cars to public transport?
I think one of the most important things is to try and join up our transport. In the Department for Transport, every Directorate General runs a different thing. There's 3 run rail, there's 1 for roads, there's 1 for aviation, 1 for maritime, and none of it is joined up. You know, with digital connectivity and all the data that's generated, we could join all this up more so we could begin to anticipate where there are problems and try and solve those problems before they come. It would also enable us to understand where the real demands and maybe pent-up demands that can't be satisfied at the moment are, so we can target our public transport better. But you're absolutely right. There's a way to go, and I think we lost an opportunity through COVID. We repurposed a number of streets for walking, cycling, micromobility. We took cars out of the centre of many cities, and unfortunately, in many places, that's now disappeared. So that opportunity to get people to think about doing transport differently or substituting a significant number of their journeys by maybe doing stuff online instead, that could have really helped us deliver on the future transport. It has kind of been lost to some extent, and maybe some of that at some stage needs to be brought back so people will think more about that walking, cycling, using micromobility, and just making those more healthy options. And maybe part of that joined up information is to tell them what the implications are of not doing that, in terms of, you know, you're using less calories because you're taking a comfortable way of travelling, and also how much carbon you are releasing on your choice of journey, for example.
That's interesting. Let's sort of ask the audience, just out of interest, quick show of hands, who travelled here today by car? Okay, so that's probably not far off your 60-odd%, I guess. Anyone come by train? Okay, 1 or 2. Bus? No, not bad. Buses are doing okay. Anyone come on their bikes? Excellent. That's what I like to see as a cyclist. Very good. So I think, I don't know, Tobin, whether you'd agree that feels like that reflects the sort of stats that you were talking about more generally.
It does, and this is an engaged audience who's clearly got an interest in transport and sustainable transport. So I guess that goes to show.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think kind of, we know that these things are often, as Phil says, that these different policy areas are often linked, and we've talked a bit about health and obviously sustainability. And kind of one of the challenges and sort of controversy has been around the clean air zone that's been introduced to try and sort of manage that. And one of our questions is whether what impact the clean air zone has had. I mean, obviously only introduced in January. And the questioner here asking whether road taxing is the answer to a cleaner and more sustainable transport system. So maybe, Jane, if I could ask you to pick that one up.
I mean, the first thing I would say that in terms of the impact of the cars, it is too early to say because it's, it is recent. We have various exemptions and other schemes, so we're transitioning at the moment. I'm absolutely confident that it will meet its objectives, but I think it's important to understand that the CAS in Newcastle is a response to a specific legal guidance and requirement from the government. So we will meet the air quality objectives that we've been set. It's not about a complete holistic modal shift in transport, and that again reflects what I was saying is we have had to do a lot of specific projects that are required by the government rather than being in a situation where we can really set our own objectives and deliver them. In terms of road tax, no, I don't think it's the answer. I think what proper fully funded public transport is the answer. I think people should be making a positive switch, not a negative one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And I suppose then coming back to this question of how we can improve the public transport offer, one of the questions we've had is we've talked a lot about the metro, and as you say, Tobin, just over 40 years old, so innovative, leading the way when it was first introduced, but an ageing fleet, and there is a new fleet to be introduced. Can you give us a bit more information about progress on that and how and whether that will improve the situation?
I can, and it is an exciting time, as those of you that follow these things on local media will have seen. Because the first of the new trains have arrived in the region. In fact, there are 3 of them in the region now, having made their way across from Switzerland. And so we can see for ourselves, and so can the people who've been involved in the process, see what an amazing change that is coming for passengers who use the Tyne and Wear Metro. But you're quite right, Jane. The system is it opened in 1980, so it is currently 43 years old. And some of the trains are actually a bit older than that because they were built several years in advance, a number of them, so that they could be commissioned and tested. And the Metro, therefore, is starting to creak a bit and show its age. And so those of you who use it regularly, I'm sure you will be torn because we all love it. It is a real asset for our region. Most cities in the UK outside London would kill for what we've got with the Metro system. And it was of a unique design that was way ahead of its time when it was designed, because it links sort of suburban rail networks built by the Victorians with tunnels that whisk you straight into the heart of the city centre of Newcastle or the centre of Gateshead or Sunderland. And that is not replicated in many other cities anywhere, really, certainly not of the size of the region that we're in. So that's fantastic, and it transports tens of millions of people a year, hundreds of thousands each day. And it adds connectivity, and it forms a backbone of our public transport network. And the buses, even though the buses were deregulated and privatised many moons ago, nevertheless, there is still the bones of an integrated system that the Metro forms the heart of. But because of the age, even though we love it in the way I've described, you're probably also quite frustrated by it at the moment if you're a regular user. And so I am sorry for that. Because the trains are failing quite regularly now. Their design life was 35 years, and so here we are with the trains getting on for 45 years old. It's not a great surprise, and I would challenge you to, those of you that were around at that time, remember what car your family owned or you owned back then, and imagine if you were asking that car not just to exist, most of them have since been scrapped, but just to do exactly the same job that they did back in 1979, 1980, the same number of miles, carrying the same number of people. You would not expect it to continue to be reliable. You'd certainly expect it to cost a lot more in maintenance, and regrettably, you would probably expect it to play up now and again. And that is what we're experiencing despite the heroic efforts of our fleet maintenance team, who are really pulling out all the stops. The trains are very mechanical in nature. They're not like the new ones where a push of a button will give you an electric, a computerized diagnostic. They rely on parts, many of which are no longer manufactured. And when I was in the depot the other day with some of the technicians, they were saying, you know, they're having to resort themselves to actually manufacturing bits of metal or bits of plastic that are no longer available from the original manufacturer. So that's what's happening behind the scenes to keep the system going the way it is. So it's not ideal. It does lead sometimes to either trains breaking down or Nexus having to temporarily reduce the service levels. And that, I should say, is replicated on some of the other infrastructure as well, but we'll not go into that. The new trains, when they are fully in service, are going to absolutely transform the experience of the people who use the metro in this region. So that I can promise you. The first ones are here, as I said. They're going to enter service to the public later on this calendar year. But new trains do take a while to manufacture and test and commission, so it'll be 2025 towards the end of the year when all of the fleet has transitioned across. I do need to give you a little warning, those of you that don't already know this is coming. New trains don't work out of the box in the way that a Hoover or a washing machine might do. They do take time to be proven on a new system and to bed in, and you can expect some technical glitches along the way. It'll be a bumpy ride. For another 18 months or so, I'm afraid. But when they are in, they will be many, many times more reliable than the outgoing fleet. I mean, transformatively reliable. The user experience will be superb, and I know some people in this room themselves have experienced the new trains. They're already pretty good for level boarding, but there's a retracting step, so anybody with mobility difficulties will be able to get on without any issues whatsoever. They're very good for people with visual impairments, but for just everybody, they're a much more comfortable user experience. The information will be better, and for the drivers, they're going to be super happy. They'll have a segregated cab with all mod cons, and the maintenance staff will have a brand new depot and a much easier fleet of trains to deliver. So the revolution is coming, we can see it, but we do need people's patience for another 18 months or so.
Okay, yeah, so it might be a bumpy ride, but I saw how you did that, but 2025, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, really exciting being a metro user in Whitley Bay. I look forward to seeing the new generation. What I was going to say, we touched on before about the clean air zone, and also about whether some form of car taxation might persuade people to move on to different modes. I think in the long term, I'm pretty convinced that pay as you drive will happen in the UK, because there's less petrol and diesel vehicles generating fuel tax, and car tax on zero emission and zero tailpipe vehicles are quite low. So I think I'm convinced there will be a transition over the next 10 years towards some form of pay as you drive for the amount of use and where you choose to drive. When that will happen in Newcastle, I don't know, but it does give the opportunity to think about demand management and encouraging people to move to those other modes. Now, many years ago, I was responsible for the feasibility team that led on the recommendations for the scheme for London, the congestion charging. And whether you love it or hate it, what it has done is the revenue from congestion charging in London is hypothecated. It means the Chancellor can't take it and spend it on general taxation. It's got to be ring-fenced for transport. And I think that could be a real opportunity if you can have this additional revenue hypothecated for transport, so you can build up that far better public transport system and encourage people to shift away from the car. And I think there could be a real opportunity for us in the future. And I certainly think you talk to a number of other cities, some of them are looking to embrace it, Cambridge, for example, at the moment. So we'll see, but there's an opportunity there. You've got to get it right, got to be equitable, because there are journeys you can't make by any other mode, and also there are people who can't afford to travel by any other mode because much public transport is eye-wateringly expensive at the moment. So we've got to make sure whatever system is equitable, and there's challenges there.
Yeah, I think that point about equity is a really important one, and I know something that's been sort of discussed quite a lot in the context of the devolution deal, and I'd like to come to that now, if I may. And I think just really would be interesting to get perspectives from all of the panel members around what you see as the opportunity with the devolution deal in terms of the future of transport and that sort of how we can make that accessible to all. Jane, can I perhaps come to you first?
I think there are two things really. First, we can take some kind of holistic approach. What I've said before is we've been very dependent on different funds and bidding to funds, so you can get money for active travel, but you can't get money for something else. So, and you've always got to kind of go with what is set by others. So we can start to think what we need instead. The other thing, of course, is we'd all like to, it'd be great to do something like they have in London with public transport. I know that, there's other questions later about that. If we can make public transport cheaper, if we can have more control over it so it's more reliable, if we can go back to what we had 40 years ago with an integrated system and 5p transfers, which I used to use, then that's what we should be looking for, and that's where the opportunities around devolution would come, I think.
And Tobin, I know you've also been quite heavily involved in these discussions. What do you see as the opportunity?
I think for me, devolution is about having tools in the box. At the moment, to deliver our transport, we don't have that many, really. We're beholden to others for the large part. The metro is the one thing that we do control, and that's got a plan for its rejuvenation, but that's still relied on a lot of central government money and an awful lot of work by people across the region to come together to ask for that money. But when it comes to buses, when it comes to railways, even when it comes to some of our long-distance highways, we're always beholden to others. And so what the devolution deal gives us an opportunity for Jane and other elected members who are accountable to the people in the region to come together and form these long-term plans. And I completely agree with the point about a long-term planning horizon where you're not beholden to the government opening up a new funding competition where we all have to drop everything and bid into it. We can say as a region what we need, what our priorities are, and plan for them, whether that's 2 years from now or even when it's 7 years from now. And along the way, there are more tools in the box in terms of some powers. Let's not pretend that this is devolution in the true sense of the term, nor even in the Scottish or Welsh sense of the term. This is some powers, slightly begrudgingly given to our region by the government in return for having an elected mayor and a new combined authority. But some of those powers are definitely worth having when it comes to transport and should help some of the integrated planning. And then the other tool is the ability to form strong partnerships. And we will be led by a mayor and a strong cabinet of council leaders. And having that strong unified voice means we'll be able to form partnerships, be it with National Highways for the road network, be it with businesses to get a long-term view of shared investment opportunities, or be it with the rail firms, and perhaps we'll come to that later on as well.
Okay, thank you. And Phil, I imagine you've sort of seen these discussions from more from a government national perspective. What would your sort of comment on be on the opportunity?
I think the first opportunity is to have a figurehead for the region that can negotiate and be the leader going to talk to government. Because whenever there's any big schemes being mooted from whatever region it is, the first question you get from both the ministers and from the senior civil servants is, who's the figurehead? Who do we talk to? So I think having that will be super important. And certainly from my perspective down at DFT, you used to see the mayors like Andy Byrne and Andy Street heading down to London, meeting with different departments, and serious negotiations for large amount of money, coming back with briefcases full of, well, not literally full of money, but just having that leadership, having that really made a difference. I think the other thing, and absolutely really important, it gives the region the opportunity to make their own decisions. Who knows better about the problems we have with transport, with mobility, with transport and health in the region than the region, the regional politicians and the like. So to actually be able to make those decisions for the region, in the region, I think is critically important. The one criticism, well, one of many criticisms about London-centric government is they think like everywhere is like London. They make decisions like London, Newcastle's like London, got similar level of public transport, They haven't a clue how different it is. And I think that's really important. So to make that happen, I think is important. But having that leader, getting the right mayor who can engage at the right level to support us, because the money coming is actually quite large. I've been at a few events recently where people said it's the best devolution deal so far, but I think the money is almost irrelevant in the sense that it's an enabler. I think we should consider that as a foundation on which we build on to bring lots more investment, both from government, both from private entities in the UK, but also internationally, because we'll be able to do that. We'll have those foundations in place to really enable that in a way that we haven't been able to do before.
Thank you. And I suppose just sort of coming back to this sort of question around the connections between the North East and other parts of the country. I mean, Tony, you sort of touched on rail. I mean, is there sort of evidence from other places that sort of having those devolution deals has made a difference in terms of those national rail links in particular?
So rail is a complicated beast and takes some taming, and a devolution deal alone won't do it. But I think you can see some cases where local influence and local control can make quite a big difference. And I would give you as Exhibit A, the London Overground, if anybody's used that, where Transport for London, using a different set of devolved powers admittedly, but took a decrepit and failing British rail line in the north of London and turned it into an extended form of the tube with integrated fares and information that really most people would feel like they're on the tube lines. So I'd take you back again to the 70s, where that's what we had here before the metro, a decrepit and failing old-fashioned train system. That was turned into a metro system which is now locally owned, locally managed. All of the Nexus employees are local government employees, and Nexus delivers its services for the local authorities in Tyne and Wear. We want to get closer to that for the local rail system on Northern Rail. Nobody can fix driver shortages overnight, but what you can do through time, by having more involvement in how the services are designed, perhaps some involvement in how even they're funded, you can work towards a more integrated and a better service for the region that you're trying to serve. For longer distance, it's a different story. I don't think we anticipate much control over the intercity operators, but we do have an issue in this region, and that's a capacity problem on the East Coast Main Line, which is insufficient for the number of trains that need to use it, be they goods trains or be they passenger trains. And as we look into the future, the most amazing, successful region that we all aspire to be, we will continue to be held back by our long distance links if we can't do something about the capacity. So the devolution deal, obviously, it can't wave at the magic wand. This is a 20-year, 30-year problem. But what it does do, back to my partnership point, it commits the government to working in partnership with us and actually Network Rail and the train companies as well to find solutions to these problems. So even those really knotty national infrastructure issues, through devolution, we can play a much stronger role.
And I guess sort of thinking about sort of the geography of that devolution deal. I mean, often when we talk about transport, we're sort of, and we're sitting here in Newcastle as a large city. And one of the questions that we've had from the audience is around the opportunities for, particularly in context of public transport across the rural northeast. And of course, you know, many people live and work in rural areas. Many people will need to come into cities for the work, and I'm just interested in the panel's reflections on what the sort of opportunities could be to improve those connections for people who are living in different parts of the region. I mean, Phil, from your sort of research interests in this space, what do you think we should be focusing on to improve that connectivity across the region?
The challenge with rural areas is they have a high proportion of older people requiring support with their mobility, and in many cases a decreasing number of public transport services. And that's really got to be rolled back in some way to make it work and ensure that people living in those more rural areas are not completely transport deprived and have to rely on cars. And as you get older, you know, your cognitive and functional decline may mean that you can't use a car. You've got to rely on other forms of transport. So there needs to be a real rethink there. And I think in the longer term, we're going to see a lot more community services supporting mobility in the rural areas. But I think automation, dare I say, may have a role to play, because if you can run safe, automated public transport shuttles, the cost of operation could be significantly less if they don't need to have a driver, and maybe you have some community volunteers that help. And so I think and this is going into the future, I think looking at the opportunities that automation may play and may be a good thing to improve rural travel is important. But I think we need to look at the whole gamut of that, because, as I say, you've got a much older population on average in the rural areas. They need access to health services, to hospitals, and to everything else. And at the moment, there's a massive decline there, which is almost spiraling. So more young people move out of the rural areas because the opportunities aren't there, and that radius of economic opportunity that good public transport give you, so for you to move for your jobs and to travel for your health and your other services and your education, are not there. So I think we've got to rethink rural transport and really open up those opportunities. So I think the Blythe Ashington line, for example, let's be really ambitious about what we build around the station, so they become hubs to bring people in from the deeper rural areas and the like, and maybe become the hubs of all the other activities that people need in those rural areas as well. So we've got to be ambitious, but I think that there's some things we can do, but it is going to need some money and some investment, and that's a real challenge at the moment. But once you've got the devolution deal, you've got that money under your control, albeit you've got to worry about all the other priorities you've got to use that for as well.
Thank you. And Jane, if I can come to you, obviously you represent a ward in a city centre, but how sort of important is it that for Newcastle there are those good connections with the more rural areas in the northeast?
Well, it's important for us as a region. I think for us as well, it is also about equity. And I said earlier I had to drive to work because I work in rural County Durham. It takes me an hour and a half on the buses, on the two buses. That's if they work. And last time I had to get the bus broke down midway, and we were stranded for an hour and in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't walkable to anywhere else. And a lot of the passengers were saying that this was a frequent occurrence. So I was very struck by how vulnerable those people were. I could phone my job and say I'm delayed and it wouldn't be a problem. A lot of people wouldn't. They would be late for starting a shift. They weren't able to access jobs. So that really brought home to me something I was already aware of on an objective level, is how vulnerable people are if you don't have a reliable bus service. And I would have to say, if you have a bus service that's run for profit, that's not a public good, then that's where those problems become. So I think it's important for us in our development as a city, also as a Labour politician, I think it's very important in terms of how we support people across the region and preventing isolation. And I would have to say I would disagree slightly with the idea of automation, because I think the benefits of drivers, and let's, I'm almost harking back to the past, but let's bring back transfers and let's bring back conductors. The social potential benefits of regular bus services with regular staff could have all kinds of other benefits in terms of how they support communities. And I think that's because it's a privatised system, those social goods aren't put into the system. I'm not anti-technology.
No. I was going to say, we've been doing quite a lot of examination of this and talking to people in rural areas. And they're quite happy not to have a driver, because they trust, rightly or wrongly, that if the technology is out there, it's only put out there because it works. Now, we can debate that all night. But what they have said is they would like community volunteers to be on those buses, so there's someone there to talk to help them with shopping, just make them feel reassured. I think that's where I said I think there'll be a lot more community involvement in this. Yeah, I would hate to arrive on an autonomous vehicle and there's no one who knows anything about it there. But I'm sure there's a way through that, but it could, from an economic point of view, it could give you the opportunity to have those more regular services. And it's regularity. If a bus service is once every 3 hours or once a week, it's not a bus service at all, really, is it? It's just a random.
Yeah. And I think, Tobin, coming to you, one of those challenges around financial sustainability of services and how you can, one of the questions are around the sustainability of having 3 bus companies in Newcastle, and yet there are parts of the region where, as Phil suggests, it's kind of once a week on a Tuesday, and so how do you kind of manage that sort of sustainability and to make sure that there are those services available?
Yeah, so one thing's for sure, the current system is not sustainable. Yeah. And I think COVID exposed that, like so many things. It took away a good chunk of ridership that's taking a very long time to come back, but it exposed the fact that the buses are absolutely essential to the communities that use them, perhaps even more so in rural areas than in some of the parts of the city where you do have alternative choices for travel. But it also exposed just how much public funding needs to go in to support those rural services. So I think what we do need is we need a cultural shift, certainly in the North East, but I would argue countrywide. Let's stop kidding ourselves that this is a commodity like a supermarket or a fuel retailer where competition can come in and somehow spread a service provision for everybody on a financially sustainable basis. It isn't. It's as requiring public funds as street lighting, pavements and bin emptying. And once we get that mindset, then perhaps we can look at delivering a different model of bus services. We do need reliable bus services, whether it's in rural areas or whether it's in more built-up areas where people have no alternative form of transport for different reasons. We do need them to be kind of formed around interchange hub points, so that you can take a local bus to the nearest point, and if you're lucky there's a train or a fast bus to get you into your destination just waiting for you. We need fares that are affordable. Something that we're doing in the here and now actually through our partnership work is introducing very affordable fares for anybody under the age of 22, and that will be true of anybody living in rural Northumberland as it will for people living in parts of the city of Newcastle, because if we can't get young people travelling sustainably to get to opportunities, then why are we bothering with anything? And so yeah, the bus network does need to be reformed. There's a variety of different models, but the main one is in return for the significant amount of public funding that goes into them today, and that needs to continue, and we do need a national commitment to keep on funding the buses at a suitable rate. In return for that, the public sector gets a high degree of say over where those buses go and what fares are charged. There is, however, one particular point, and it goes back to the discussions about taxation and CASs and carrots and sticks. We've all got a role to play in this. All of you who drove here tonight, and you'll all have had very good reasons for it, but we're all part of this issue where there's a tendency in the UK to not want to travel by bus. And we've got to find a societal solution to that. Yeah, we can make the buses better and cheaper, but we still need to make ourselves challenge our own decisions every day. If you could have travelled by bus on a particular day, not everybody can, but if you could, why didn't you? And let's design services around that question and engage with communities to make it as appealing as we possibly can.
Yeah. I mean, I think that point about culture change is a really interesting one. One of our questions, and you alluded a bit to this, Phil, is around sort of the role of free public transport. For older people in London, if you're 60, you get free public transport. Here in the North East, you have to wait until you hit state retirement age. So I'm interested also, the point about the recently introduced affordable fares for younger people, which if you compare that to what's on offer in Scotland, where young people get free public transport, is there any evidence that actually providing that free transport for particular age groups can start to drive behaviour change, as well as make sure that it's more accessible. But perhaps maybe Jane, do you want to start?
I think for me, in terms of change in behaviour, yes, absolutely, it needs to be cheaper and have free offers, but it's the reliability that will really change behaviour. If you're looking at, people, for example, school children getting the bus to school instead, you need to be able to be confident the bus will come and you'll get to school on time, which my daughter found this morning didn't happen. So I think that's where my key thing would be in behaviour change.
Toby?
Well, look, in Estonia, they made the buses, or they made all public transport free. And of course that increased the number of people who did use the trams and the buses, but the streets are still gridlocked. So there's something more to it than just it being a free commodity. When concessionary travel was introduced for 65s and over, as it was originally, and disabled people, of course ridership levels shot up. But since COVID, they've gone down again, even though it's free. My dad doesn't own a bus pass, even though he's in his 80s. You can't necessarily expect free travel to correlate to a major societal change. I think there's something more to it that we need to do. The other point though I'd say is, yeah, everybody wants it to be free or dirt cheap or whatever it might be, but these are choices that we've got to make. It's public money going in. I'd say let's not dress it up as anything else in the privatised bus network, certainly not on the rail network. And society only wants to pay so much tax at any given point in time and has got any number of different priorities. And would you prioritise childcare, care of vulnerable adults over more people travelling for free on your local bus network? Well, these are difficult choices that elected politicians have to take, really, and it's my job to bring the choices to them with a price tag attached, and it's for the public and the politicians they elect to make these difficult choices.
Phil, is this something that sort of you've seen being debated at a national level?
It is, and the idea of free public transport has been used in a number of countries with different limited levels of success. But in some of those countries, they were countries that already had really high levels of public transport, such as in parts of Switzerland and the like. It doesn't matter if free. It's got to be good. You don't want to be free, but it's rubbish. You've got to be free and it's good. So it's getting that balance, which I think is a real challenge. But what we're certainly seeing trends in less young people are taking driving tests and taking their license. So there is a generation that aren't as wedded to the car. There is a slight change there, and there's an opportunity. I remember having a debate with Tobin years ago about the fact that once you left school, you lost all your free travel and every concessionary travel, and they were the market of the school kids that had been using public transport all their lives, and then you cut them off from it, they have to pay full fare. Now that's changing, and that's really important. All we can do is gradually get people to think that public transport is the norm. If you look at some other countries that have really pushed public transport and healthy travel, a 30-year change in Copenhagen from being a purely car-driven environment to loads of people using cycles, even in the middle of winter, and using public transport. You can, over time, get that change, but it's getting the generations to think differently from when I was a kid, where everybody began to aspire to have a car. That was a sign of success. Now, cars are really convenient, but I think in this day and age, there's all sorts of other ways you can travel. And as I say, if we join up the information on what people's needs and demands are and understand their demand for travel, we can configure a transport system for the North East which is better. But at the end of the day, it will cost money.
Okay. And I think that sort of sense that actually engaging people to understand what the drivers are. I mean, you've talked a bit about this, Toby, particularly, and one of our questions was from a public transport user in Newcastle, how can I use my experiences of the system to bring about service improvements and changes for the better? So I suppose kind of practically, what are the ways, if we need to engage people to think about how we can drive those behavioural changes, what are the ways in which people can inform that process now?
Yeah, I think we need to expand the engagement and the dialogue with the general public. I think we really do. It's great that there's people here tonight who are interested in this subject, and I'm sure from all walks of life, but there's a whole series of people out there whose voices aren't really heard. And I have to say, bus passengers in particular, generally the demographic of bus users are from people who are particularly voiceless. And I think that you see that reflected in how much press coverage there is of the railways for 3% of the people travelling in the country versus buses, 3/4 of public transport users, if not more. And you hear an awful lot more about trains than you do buses. So Nexus has got an engagement panel. People can feed in their voice and their views as part of an ongoing user engagement. But you can feed in through the council processes, and I'm sure Jane will talk about that. But I do think we need to, perhaps as part of the devolution arrangements, broaden the community's involvement, feeding in constantly what they want to see in services.
Okay, and Jane, just in terms of the council, how does the council sort of engage to understand what's really important to people in terms of transport?
Well, again, we kind of engage at a forum level where we're working with people, we consult on certain schemes, but where it's often very important, and we probably want to encourage people to do this more, is where people give us those little bits of individual information that are actually making a difference to choices that we're not always aware of. So bus stops are a big challenge, actually, and that's something that can sometimes get overlooked. But when people feed back to us about a bus stop being in the wrong location, or it's not waterproof, all these kind of things can actually, these are the life experiences of people that are preventing them using buses. So I think it's maybe what we need to be looking at is how people can find it easier to tell us what they need us to know, rather than us always setting the questions. So I think that's our challenge in consultation, to be honest.
Okay. So Phil, do you want to add to that?
Just capturing those view of the users of a system is really, really important. And your university is very good at that. We've got lots of techniques for doing that, and we're happy to help in any way we can. I think the other thing that would be really important is to have these longitudinal studies, so you can see, have these studies over a long period of time, so you can see the changes in attitude, changes in use, and actually understand what are the drivers behind that and what new things need to be done. Because I think they have that in London, and I think it works really well. Okay, they're much better funded than we are, but I think it's something as a region should be part of the long-term ambition, because those longitudinal studies really do inform and keep you on your toes about what's not just happening now, but what you need to think about in a number of years' time.
I think, Tobin, do you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I agree with that, but actually I did want to put in a plug for Newcastle University at this point.
Feel free.
Just in case anybody thinks I'm completely obsessed by the new metro trains, you're right. But the plug comes from Newcastle University's Open Lab, who Nexus worked with in designing the trains. And it's perhaps a good example of user engagement, because I don't think there's a train in the country, or even probably the world, that's had more user input from all people, all walks of life, using all sorts of different technology, from pen and paper through to 3D goggles, explaining what they wanted a train to look like, what needs they had as a traveller, and those absolutely were taken into account in the design of the trains in every aspect. And so it can be done, and we do it, but absolutely we need to do it an awful lot more.
Okay, so on that note of end user engagement, it feels like this could be a good moment to perhaps open it out to questions that we might have from the floor. So we've got some roving mics. As ever with these things, when there were a lot of people together, if you could just introduce yourselves and then ask your question and try and keep it framed as a question, that would be really, really helpful. So I've got a gentleman at the back. We'll go to this gentleman first, and then.
Hi, Sandy Irvin. I'm a member of the Green Party. I keep hearing phrases about active travel, but I've heard no mention of the most active form of travel, which is on foot, and the needs of pedestrians. I'd like to hear some ideas of how we could give pedestrians a better deal.
Okay, thank you. We'll take 2 or 3. So gentleman who had his hand up on the back row.
Lawrence Taylor, 20 years in the rail industry, and I was on the first ever metro. So that gives you an idea how old I am. But I'm not going to talk about trains, more about cycling. We talk about cycling in terms of improving health, and reducing obesity and reducing emissions, and providing opportunity for people who don't have cars. But we tend to forget about the economic opportunity. Now, Utrecht in the Netherlands, they've installed a comprehensive cycle network, and they estimate a 250 million a year economic benefit. Now, that seems to be something worth chasing, but in Newcastle, there's a few schemes gone in, but at the current rate of progress, we're looking at about 110 years before we get a decent cycle network. Now, do the panel have any ideas on how we can speed that process up?
Okay, thank you. And the front row, please.
Hello, I'm Paul Baker. I'm from the Public Transport Users Group. Questions for... Hello? It's working.
Yeah.
Questions mainly for Tobin and Transport North East, I think. Roadmap for full integration. Is it foreseeable? We've been pushing for this in the public transport users before you did the report. What I mean by full integration, I mean bikes, cycles, pedestrians, rail, not just the buses and the metro. We really, if we want people out of cars, it's not just reliable, it's not just cheap fares, you're right. It's about something that's good, something that's there. It should be 24/7. It should be like nearest to the convenience of a car. Is there a roadmap? Is it even on the horizon?
Okay, thank you for those questions. We'll take those ones first and then come back for some more. So I think we've got a sort of a real question around active travel that's come up a bit, but the point about walking and how we can sort of encourage that. The cycling and that kind of interesting question around, you know, actually the economic benefit, but how long is it going to take us to really sort of shift the dial in terms of cycling? And as I say, as a cyclist myself, I'd be right behind that question. And I guess wrapped around that, what's the roadmap to get us to full integration? And Tobin, you talked very much about the timescale around the metros and how long that will take, but I think that the question is much more around that sort of wider integration. So I think maybe perhaps Tobin, we'll start with you. Do you want to have a crack at some of those questions, please?
On the walking point, I did want to say that for me is the biggest change that we can make very quickly. More walking for everybody, no matter what their mobility position, would make the biggest impact on the environment, the biggest impact on public health, and get us closer towards our sustainability and transport goals than any other sort of intervention. So I'm a huge fan of wider pavements, better lighting, measures to make people feel safer when it's dark, better protection, or better road crossings, protection against traffic. And we are doing a lot of work with the councils in the region to try and make sure we've got the schemes that they want to deliver on our long-term pipeline, we call it, roadmap if you want, to make sure that we've got them prioritised for funding. Because, it's actually other people on the street walking along is the thing that's going to attract you to walk along. Nobody wants to walk along a dark footpath on their own. So that will itself engender more success. In terms of the wider roadmap, I'll leave the cycling point for others, but the wider roadmap, we've got a transport plan for the region, and I'm sure some of you have read it. That transport plan at the high level does talk about all of these things that have come up today and many more besides. So we do have a reasonably coherent plan, and it's certainly agreed to by all of the political players in the region. What we'll be able to do with the devolution deal is to start taking it down to the next level for delivery. We're doing a lot of work now, and we will be doing over the course of the next year to get ready for the new mayoral combined authority. the new mayor will have one early job, which is to present their vision of a transport plan, hopefully simply building on the work that we produced, to their cabinet. And once we've got a newly agreed transport plan, we absolutely want to get motoring. So some of these points of integration, I suspect there might have been a little bus fragmentation point at the back of Paul's question there, but integration with cycling and walking, better rail services, even more electric vehicle charging points and a better long distance road network all need to have well-developed plans so that our new combined authority can really start to deliver with the money that it's got on those partnerships that I talked about earlier.
Okay, thank you. And Jane, coming to you, I mean, I think that sort of sense of the environment around the city and your portfolio, what are the things that the city are doing around that kind of active travel, walking and cycling and joining things up?
Well, absolutely agree about the importance of walking, and we're actually quite lucky in Newcastle because of in some respects, because of the size of the city. It's a very walkable city, and we want to do more with. I have actually mentioned walking already because I mentioned school streets and encouraging children to walk to school because they feel safe to walk to school is a very important part of the strategy. Similarly, we call them neighbourhood low traffic zones in Newcastle because of some of the contentious discussions around how LTNs have become politicised. Everything we do where we reduce the amount of car traffic in an area is about making it easier and pleasanter to walk and cycle so people walk more. The other thing I would say as well is that if we have better public transport and people are more likely to use the bus or metro, that also encourages walking because you get in the habit of walking to get to the public transport. And then perhaps you might start to do more journeys by foot altogether. So there are lots of ways that works. And we are doing a lot on that and very committed to it. Our team has been extremely successful, and I have absolutely no credit for this in getting active travel funding and putting schemes in place and in the amount of work that has gone into the cycle network. The problem is that, as I've said about 5 times now, but it bears repeating, we have been dependent on pots of funding. So we haven't been able to design our ideal cycle network and fund it. We've had to be able to bid for things when the funding became available. So if we have better funding situation and more control as to how we allocate the funding, then that gives us the opportunities to improve the cycle network.
And do you think, I mean, just on that, the challenge of the kind of piecemeal competitive funding pots for things, is your expectation that in the context of devolution it'll be easier to deliver a more integrated approach?
That's one of my big hopes. It's not that we're going to have all the money that we would want or be able to do everything, but we're able to take that integrated, holistic approach, and we're not going to be bidding against each other to do things. We're going to look as a region as to what needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. And Phil, your take on active travel?
It's a no-brainer. You know, all evidence shows if people are walking more, cycling more, they're more healthy, and if they can do that for longer distances, great. But as you say, connecting into the public transport network and walking at either end just makes such a difference to, first of all, the quality of people's life because they are fitter, the quality of the environment because there's less motorised transport. So it's something we should be pursuing, but it's got to be joined up. And if you have joined up funding, that's fantastic. The crazy thing about government funding is it's all in pots from one department or another. Quite often it's limited, that it's got to be spent within a year or so in that spending review or in that actual financial year, which means quite often local authorities, transport authorities, universities as well, are exhausted because they're spending their time writing these really complicated bids for amounts of money, having them at the wrong time, in the wrong time frame, that quite often sometimes they're wasted the opportunity because you're spending it on things that you wouldn't spend it on, but you have to spend it on that because that's all you can spend it on in that year. So it gets rid of all that. I mean, that sounds like a bit of a ramble, but it does actually make a lot of sense. It gets rid of a lot of that, so you've got that continuity, that longer term plan of funding. I think it will make such a difference.
And can I chime in on that one as well, because it's great, because Phil has seen it at first hand, how the government functions.
Bang my head
in
off the wall more times than you can imagine.
But there's 2 other aspects about this sort of continuity of funding. The first is with competitive pots, you have to drop everything and design your scheme there and then. The devolution funding is going to give us money or we've already actually started to receive some of it, to help design schemes up front so that they're ready to go when there is capital funding available. And then the second thing I think is important, which is with that long-term pipeline of schemes that Newcastle Council and other councils want to deliver, they can be much better integrated into your urban planning and your land use planning, so that you have got the confidence that you can put infrastructure in as you plan for future developments.
Okay, so some very consistent messages there coming about that long-term planning to enable us to be more integrated. I'd like to go back to some more questions. So if I can go to the lady sitting third row back on the end, first of all.
Thank you. Sally Young, North East Child Poverty Commission. I don't want to lose the point on inequality and the cost of transport. In the North East, more than half of our children live in households which have less than the minimum income standard. So we have a lot of very poor kids in the North East. Given how our facilities are, and most of us don't live in 15-minute neighbourhoods, would it not be transformative for children and young people, and also for people under 21 who are studying, to have reduced or free transport? And Jane quite rightly focused on reliability, but surely the more people that use public transport, the more used it is, the more reliable it is, the more safe it is. You get that virtual cycle. So would it not be transformative for the new mayor to actually declare for the North East children what the Mayor of London has for their children?
Thank you, Sally. Gentleman in the front.
Hello, thank you. Is this working? Stephen Kiffin, I'm a resident of Scotswood when the trains first started and cycled in every day from then. Now I live in East Jesmond, Jane, so I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the cultural change required for people to really want to do this and to find ways of active travel. Recycle here to those who want to keep you put my hand up. Why do people, how can we really enable people, rather than put punishments in cost, attractive, enable people to really want to do this, so that all those short-term urban journeys become pedestrianised and cycling. And I know that you're facing a huge amount of barrage about this, so I want to give you the opportunity to talk about culture change at a voluntary level rather than through policy change.
Thank you. And I think there's a lady in the back row. I will try and make sure we get to everyone, but I'll take these three first and then go back to the panel.
Hi, Margaret Montgomery, a regular public transport user. A few points that have been raised. I agree with everything Sally said about making transport for young people free. I'd like to know how much of an impact it's had when you had 11-year-olds and under could travel free with an adult paying, and also the impact of the £1.20 one way, £2 all day, what impact that has had on user uptake. And certainly, I think when Jane said there's been a drop in the people who have free transport because they're retired since COVID, I would, as a regular user, I would perhaps dispute that, because I think it's been one of the big cultural changes where people have actually used cars all of their life, and the moment they get a free pass, they then use buses. And I do think one of the big things that we can do, even though you've said it doesn't work in some places in the world, is to actually think of transport in the way we think of the National Health Service, education. Nobody questions that public money goes into those services. And I think we need to think public transport needs to be seen as a public service. And if we seriously want to get rid of petrol cars, diesel cars off the roads, and I'm not saying everybody's going to give them up altogether, but we've got to have a better public transport system. It's the only way forward.
Okay, thank you. So we'll come back to our panel on those questions. The point about sort of particularly child poverty and the impact of free public transport and the kind of culture change. I think, Jane, if I can start with you on those questions.
Okay, well, I'll answer in terms of the free transport first. I mean, I absolutely agree in terms of making sure that people have access to transport, and that I would be interested in seeing it free for younger people. I'm also particularly interested in whether it could be free or low cost for people on a low wage and unwaged as well, because I think in terms of people's access to employment and services, it's hugely important. I absolutely agree that public transport is a public good. I think it should be publicly owned and publicly managed as that. I'm not going to be the mayor. The mayor's not going to have that amount of control, but I think we should be looking towards that in the terms of the way that we see it. With regard to the culture change, yes, we have introduced one of our neighbourhood low traffic zones recently in East Jesmond. It is very challenging because you have people who are reliant on travelling by car. And what we do in any of these things is that we don't close the roads. What we do is we introduce what we call modal filters so that you can walk and cycle on them, but you can't drive anymore. That is very challenging for people because routes that they have previously used and that they will often rely on and have built their lives around in terms of how they manage their time aren't available anymore. And it is very tricky. What the hope is that by making those areas somewhere that is easier and pleasanter to walk, more people will start to do that. Some people will continue to use cars through other routes, but it should be a positive switch rather than people feeling forced out. So I'm going to take the opportunity to give a shout out over there to Ali Stansfield, who was from Sustrans, who has done an enormous amount of work for us on school streets and engagement. And sorry to embarrass you there, and says you are the example of somebody who does that positive culture change, because she's gone in and worked with school communities before we've introduced school streets, which make it no longer possible for you to drop your child absolutely out the door. But if you're asking people to switch, you engage with children, you get them to be the messengers, you engage with families, you talk about needs, and yeah, a lot more alleys is going to be one of the answers for that.
Okay. Tobin, do you want to pick up this theme? We've touched on it a bit before, but
yeah. So to answer the question, would it be transformative? Well, yes, of course it would. And do we want to achieve it? And I would imagine everybody in this room absolutely would agree with it. Can we achieve it now? I think the answer is no. But could it be a long-term aim? I think it certainly is something that has been achieved in Scotland, as was noted earlier, in London and more latterly in Greater Manchester. But we do have to not kid ourselves. Firstly, it does cost money, and so there needs to be prioritisation. So the lady's right, we spend money on the NHS, and a lot of our time at the moment in my team is spent talking about how better public transport and active travel help you get yourself fitter and relieve the burden on the NHS and help people lead to more longer and more economically productive lives. So there's an economic benefit for the nation, but sadly, at the moment, in the way that we run ourselves in this country, that doesn't translate itself into money to spend on subsidising bus fares yet. But I think with the devolution deal, that's something that can be looked at in more detail. In the here and now, it is very difficult, I have to say, to offer even reduced travel on buses, let alone free. And that is because the bus companies are commercial operators. They're entitled to charge a fare, and we can pay them subsidies in lieu of that fare, but the subsidy that they'll receive is obviously relatively high because it is reimbursing them for the fare that they didn't charge. Now, as we sit here right now, we are working on this quite cheap fare for young people, which will be £1 is our aim, anywhere in the region by bus. It's not free, but it's a step towards it. But understandably, that's leading to some very complex commercial negotiations with the bus operators. And when we talk about the 60-plus travel, the concessionary travel scheme, which is free travel for anybody at retirement age or over, and disabled people, that costs this region in the order, I think it's about £60 million per annum. It doesn't come for free. They're not. You may not be paying when you're boarding the bus with a pass, but it's costing actually the local councils that money. It's certainly costing the state that money. So it's a different dynamic when buses are franchised, as they are in London, and currently Greater Manchester is introducing that system. It still doesn't make it free, but it makes it a lot simpler to negotiate. And that's the type of environment that perhaps may be possible. Some of the powers that the combined authority will have may make that simpler, but these are political choices that need to be taken, and they are also funding choices.
Thank you. And I mean, Phil, coming to you, you alluded to earlier that kind of the opportunity to quantify the benefits of more active travel to a sort of wider system in terms of healthcare and so on, and actually measuring the difference over time. In your experience, are there places that do this well, so you can kind of, because it's part of the culture change, is to be able to sort of say, well, by doing this, these are the differences I'm making with my carbon footprint or keeping myself healthier longer.
I think some cities have tried to quantify that in different ways. And once you can show that you're actually getting some return on your investment and it's actually making a difference, then you can quantify what is the savings of that in terms of health or in terms of the environment and the like. And one of the challenges we have, it doesn't matter how much you spend on transport to make transport better and get health outcomes. The NHS are not going to give transport money for doing that. So it's working out what is the social balance. But in London, for example, they have a lot of social and behavioural evaluation of a lot of their schemes in a way to actually show what the return on investment is, and also to show that it's for TfL to show to Treasury that the decisions they're making are making a difference. And I think the more we can understand that, the more we can develop techniques to actually monitor that and deliver, to show that the decisions we're making and the changes in transport we're making are actually making a difference, the more people see that it's worth investing in that. And that may unlock other funding as well. But the challenge is quite often you're doing something in transport like clean air zones where you're actually trying to reduce the peak level of NO2, which is, it goes above a certain level. It's instantly harmful for people. And you're doing that to help with health outcomes, but you're spending a transport budget to do it. You're not getting any thanks from the NHS for doing that. So it's trying to join up more to actually understand all those implications, because transport doesn't live in a box. It's part of the bigger societal thing we do, and the decision we make here has positive benefits there, maybe has negative benefits there. And we need to understand all of that to actually understand how we target things to really improve society.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Ooh, lots of hands going up. I think, can we perhaps go over to this side of the room? Saw a hand go up, Peter? So third row back.
Tobin partly answered the question, but realistically, it's worth remembering that Tyne and Wear actually once led the country with a fully integrated transport system. The 86 Transport Act came along, buses deregulated. London alone kept its regulated transport system. The question simply is this: the major challenge for me for the new combined authority is to go some step towards re-regulation of bus services. If Greater Manchester is doing it, the political choice has to be, surely, for the new mayor to actually, if not follow suit, at least take some steps towards going to a Greater Manchester solution. Is it doable? In the words of Keir Starmer, is this a great example of taking back control, which apparently he's wedded to? I think it's your question, Tobin, really.
Thank you. Much used catchphrase by both political parties. But okay, so we'll come back to re-regulation. I wanted to just have on this side of the room, lady in the stripy jumper.
Hello, Helen from Susterans also. I was just going to ask what position you think e-scooters have in the future of transport.
Oh, I wondered when they were going to come out.
I just want to say I read a report recently that said they're actually replacing shorter journeys that people would have walked. So I originally was a supporter, but then that challenges my idea of them. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. And gentleman in the jumper in the second row.
Hello, I'm Daniel. I'm a high school student, and the question I wanted to pose is surrounding the concept of a tact-far plan, which is sort of like it's what Switzerland uses for their sort of timetable of their public transport, where each mode of transport is set up to depart from like hub locations at the same time, so that you're not waiting for ages once you get off the metro and you're trying to get to the next bus. Is that a possibility in Newcastle? Is that being discussed, and is there sort of like like Tobin said, a sort of pipeline is that in the pipeline?
Okay, thank you. So, so we've got bus re-regulation, e-scooters, good thing, and something around can we do it as well as the Swiss, I think. Can I also throw in another one that there was a question from our audience, which I didn't cover earlier, which maybe comes linked possibly to the e-scooter, but there's a slogan, let's electrify everything. Would the panel agree this is deeply unsustainable? So let's start off. I think we're running a little bit short of time, so if all the panel members don't feel you have to answer all of those questions, but if you want to sort of focus in. So I'm thinking, Tobin, bus re-regulation. What's your view?
It is a political choice, is the answer, and therefore not one for me to say. But what I'd do is repeat what I said earlier. Devolution is about tools in the box, and the ability to start re-regulating is one of those tools. So it's my job to develop the options for the decision takers. E-scooters I'm not touching with a barge pole, so that'll save some time. Otherwise my mum would come in and duff me up. Integrated timetables, yeah, they would be lovely. We need integrated ticketing first, I think, or more integrated ticketing than we've currently got. We're working on a lot of developments of the pop card so that you'll be able to use it on the bus and on the local rail network. Integrated timetables in the Swiss style are absolutely, a transport planner's Valhalla. We would love to get there. I think if we get a regular enough bus network on the core routes, then actually you shouldn't even need to rely on a timetable. If it's a 10 or 15 minute frequency, and so is the metro, then it should happen relatively naturally. But the ideal would be to get to the place you're talking about.
Okay, so Nirvana is possible. Jane, your thoughts? The tricky ones, bus, e-scooters?
Yeah, bus regulation, that was one of the attractions for me, my colleagues certainly within Newcastle, and I think the other cabinets and councils who have supported devolution was the opportunity to do that, to do the kind of things that Andy Burnham's doing in Manchester, absolutely. I mean, there are pros and cons to devolution. It's not the kind of devolution we'd ideally want, but the opportunities it offers around transport was what made it attractive, and regulation has to be. The opportunities that may be offered by doing this, and that is part of the part of the discussion and negotiation, but that's the attraction, isn't it? It's to be able to do something like that. E-scooters, an interesting one. I'm a very militant pedestrian, and I live quite near the city centre, so when the e-scooters were introduced, I was normally outraged about them. I was a councillor at the time, but I wasn't a decision maker on it. And I've often been known to move them out of the way very forcefully. I would never have imagined that I would be the one who'd have to decide on whether I extended the trial or not. In the end, I was that person, and I did agree to extend the trial because I genuinely think e-scooters have a role to play. What we've done in Newcastle is tried to modify so they can no longer just be parked anywhere people want. They have parking zones, so they're not in the way of pedestrians. Working with Neuron, who provide them very much around safe riding, trying to bring in new technology, so you can't have people tandem riding, things like that, riding on pavements. So it's about the use of technology to improve. I think there's a debate about the extent to which they're valuable. I would be very concerned if people were using them instead of walking. The evidence that we've been given, and I think we'd need more robust evidence on this, is it does tend to replace quite a lot of taxi journeys potentially. I don't, so it's looking at it as an option. Some people use them for commuting. They're actually quite valuable for people who aren't, because we don't always have that reliable bus service and that 24-hour bus service, so they have a role. I think a regulated scheme of the kind that we have is very positive. the proliferation of private e-scooters, which I would remind everybody are still illegal in Newcastle, even though the orange ones are, that is worrying because of the speeds that they can go, about the, you know, so there are safety issues as well. I think with all of these things, it's about embracing new technology and find ways to make it work, which is what I had to do. And I've, so far I've managed.
Embracing new technology. Phil, can I ask you that sort of question? Is that let's electrify everything?
I think if you spoke to the DFT, that's probably one of the views they had. They're very much pro-electric everything. I think electrification has a role to play. It helps decarbonise road vehicles. And bear in mind that something like 30% of domestic greenhouse gas emissions come from transport. And of that 30%, about 85 to 90% come from road transport. So there are some low-hanging fruits of actually trying to decarbonise road transport. The downside is there's a lot of resources required for electric vehicles in terms of how you manufacture the batteries and the like. So the embedded carbon in them is higher than that from a petrol or diesel vehicle, but you obviously get the benefit of the tailpipe emissions. What I would say is you can't electrify everything. If we can get people to use other sustainable forms of transport, great. I think we need to look at hydrogen and its role it can play for larger and hard to decarbonise vehicles such as off-road vehicles, HGVs and the like. And DFT are looking at trials of putting electric wires above the road, what we call catenary. So lorries can drive down a motorway connecting to electric power above the road or conductive below. I think that's absolutely bonkers. But that's how far down the electrification route. I think some e-fuels and some of the moves towards sustainable aviation fuels will have some role to play. But I think you've got to be careful with all these drop-in fuels. That it's not smoke and mirrors, and actually behind that there's a massive amount of carbon being generated somewhere else down the chain, or there's other disbenefits about how those fuels are made or what sources they're using. So there's still a long way to go. That thing that really irritated me in COP26, when all the politicians came out at the end of it, slapped themselves on the back saying, we've found the solutions to so much, technology will solve all our problems, you can go away and keep doing your things as you're doing, your business as usual. No. The scale of transition towards net zero is massive. And from an individual, from a business, from a local authority, we've got to recognise that the transition is bigger than the politicians are letting you know at the moment. And we've got to get people to think about doing things differently.
Thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our time this evening, so I don't think we have any time for any more questions, but I do very, very quickly just want to go through the panel and just ask them, just a one-liner in question time style. If you had the freedom to implement one policy to transform our transport, the future of our transport in the North East, what would it be? So one line, starting with you, Tobin.
Think very carefully when you travel next and ask yourself, are you travelling the most sustainable way?
Okay. And Phil?
Yeah, let data, let information tell you about the impacts of all your travel, so you make smarter travel choices, which may mean you don't travel at all that day.
Okay. And Jane, policy change.
Yeah, I'm going to do more than one line. I would say our problems with transport reflect the problems in our society. We live in an atomised, profit-driven society, and really the one-liner would be international socialism. That's not going to happen anytime soon. So failing that fully funded, fully publicly owned public transport, I'm not expecting that immediately either. So one thing, policy change I would like to see us make in Newcastle is to be able to introduce safe, reliable and affordable bus transport to all Newcastle secondary school students, because I think that would make a huge change. It would make that huge positive opportunity, and it would be putting faith in the next generation, so who are going to have to take on a lot of the changes.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I'm afraid, everyone, that is all we'd have time for. So please join me in thanking our panel. It's been a very broad-ranging discussion. So Blythe, Councillor Jane Byrne and Tobin Hughes. Thank you. So before we finish, just say we hope that you will join us for our next event for the Newcastle Debates. And sorry we haven't been able to answer everyone's questions, but we will be doing some more of these sessions and there'll be further details announced shortly. And if you'd like to receive information, you can subscribe to our email mailing list. And I think there should be a list, an address up on the screen there. Very much hope you've enjoyed this evening's discussion. Thank you again to our panel. Thank you, the audience, for your questions this evening. And can I wish you a safe and pleasant onward journey, however you might be taking it.